Background on World War II and America's involvement. War began to uprise in Europe and Asia in the late 1930s. With the news of the war upcoming in other countries, the U.S. military leaders and President Roosevelt began small preparations for war. Germany began the overtake of several countries in Europe under the control of Hitler. Germany invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, France, Poland, and many more. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. This is the beginning of World War II. The United States was down in numbers in both equipment and soldiers compared to Germany. Most Americans believed that the United States should stay neutral up until Pearl Harbor. However, the United States did aid to Britain in the war by supplying them with military defense vehicles and weapons. In 1941, Japan bombed the United States, which led to the entry of America into World War II. What is the arsenal of democracy? The arsenal of democracy was originally from President Franklin D. Roosevelt's call to America to rise up and aid in the war efforts to help the Allied forces. With the support and contributions that came from Detroit, it became known as the arsenal of democracy. Decisions that were made involving war and Detroit. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress to approve around $1.2 billion in defense spending, which was the largest peacetime appropriations request ever. Bill Knudsen, the president of GM, was called to Washington to talk with President Roosevelt. Knudsen worked at Ford Motor Company before joining GM, and because he was experienced with all the aspects of the manufacturing process and acquainted with most of the automotive industrial leaders, Roosevelt made him a point man for production of vehicles, tanks, aircrafts, weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Knudsen was an initial member of the National Defense Council's Advisory Commission, the director of the Office of Production Management, and the Air Technical Command. Eventually promoted to the lieutenant general, Knudsen was charged with focusing America's manufacturing might on its wartime needs. The government ordered a non-military output ceased in December of 1941, and the last civilian vehicle, a Ford, rolled off the line on February 2, 1942. President Roosevelt's 16th fireside chat was the call to America to become the arsenal of democracy and was aired on December 29, 1940.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. We have furnished the British great material support, and we will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination. The British have received invaluable military support from the heroic Greek army and from the forces of all the governments in exile. Their strength is growing. It is the strength of men and women who value their freedom more highly than they value their lives. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war. I base that belief on the latest and best of information.
Who was in charge of the Detroit war efforts? October of 1940, Bill Knudsen met with and convinced the directors of the American Automobile Manufacturers Association of the serious work that needed to be done. Over the course of the war, many of the AAMA directors were put in charge of leading various important projects. K.T. Keller, the president of the Chrysler Corporation, was placed in charge of the tank arsenal in Warren. The Tank Automotive Center, responsible for the design, production, delivery, and servicing of every vehicle in the military, was moved from Washington, D.C. to the Union Guardian Building in Detroit and placed under the direction of Brigadier General Alfred Glancy, another GM executive. George Romney, who was the spokesman for the AAMA, became managing director of the Automotive Council for War Production in 1943. Alvin McCauley, the chairman of Packard Motor Company, helped to facilitate that company's aircraft engine production. Albert Kahn's architectural firm became creators of Ford's Rouge plant, designed factories, offices, and airfields all over the country, and eventually oversaw $200 million in wartime government contracts. Where and how was the war equipment made? Willow Run Factory. Ford was asked to build B-24 Liberator bombers designed by California-based Consolidated Aircraft Company. They were already producing the bombers at the rate of 1.5 per day. Charles Sorensen, a Ford executive and close friend to Henry Ford, thought that they could be produced at a rate of 1 an hour. To achieve this, the government hired Albert Kahn to design the Willow Run plant. The plant employed over 40,000 people and covered 80 acres near Ypsilanti. Kahn had a reputation of bringing air and light to factory spaces, but had to create this factory with no windows in order to meet the wartime security requirements. There was a shortage of tools and supplies, prevented the plant from having full production until 1943, creating the nickname Will It Run. But Willow Run eventually produced to Sorensen's prediction and brought the cost per unit down from $238,000 to $138,000. By 1945, 8,685 bombers were produced at the Willow Run factory. Sorensen discussed in his autobiography the timeline for which this plant was set. On February 25, 1941, the project approved in Washington. On April 18, 1941, official groundbreaking ceremony happened. May 3, 1941, first structural steel erected. August 12, 1941, first machine tools installed. November 15, 1941, first production man-hours. July 12, 1942, first acceptance of knockdown units to be delivered over the road to San Diego and Fort Worth consolidated plants. At this time, Willow Run plant was 90% completed. The Army and Chrysler built another Kahn factory on the other side of the city to mass-produce tanks. Construction began in September 1940, and the first tanks rolled off the line 7 months later. Covering over 1 million square feet, the factory was the largest such facility in the world. Within a year, it had produced 2,000 M3 tanks, or General Lee tanks, and was the first plant to be awarded the Armed Forces E flag for excellence in production. In 1942, the plant began to produce M4 Sherman tanks, and in 1943 created 6,612 units. Toward the war's end, workers assembled the last of 3 models, the M26 Pershing, and created 22,234 tanks manufactured at the factory. Automobile manufacturers weren't the only ones involved in the war efforts in Detroit. Companies that made household goods created supplies from bullets to gas masks. The Detroit tank arsenal used parts made from over 700 different suppliers, many of which were local shops and factories. The Navy was sent thousands of landing crafts, patrol boats, and rescue boats from boats manufacturers Chris Craft and Hacker Boat Company. Park and Davis Pharmaceutical Company provided dried blood plasma, ointments, germicides, vaccines, serums, penicillin, field dressings, gauze, and many more medical supplies. Jam Handy, an industrial filmmaker, created training films for the military. Persuasive and patriotic propaganda were created by advertisers and media writers to boost morale and production. Printing plants churned out tons of writers to boost morale. Printing plants churned out tons of instructional booklets and technical manuals, and farmers worked the land surrounding the city in order to feed the hungry workers and their families. Changes and effects in Detroit. When World War II first began, American automobile companies had no interest in building military machines. The industry was just starting to recover from the Depression and was starting to make big money. Many of the plants didn't have the right equipment to build the military defense equipment or the factory room. There was one company, however, who had the buildings required for the production, along with some auto plants built in the late 1930s. This was the Ford Motor Company River Rouge complex located in Dearborn, Michigan. The Ford Company originally agreed to make 9,000 Rolls-Royce aircraft engines for the American and British militaries. However, in June of 1940, Henry Ford rejected the arrangements. Henry Ford did not want to send anything to Britain, and General Motors did not want to shut down production for vehicles of civilians. What specifically important things changed during Detroit's assistance in the war efforts? Unlike the other cities in the nation, Detroit became a war production boom town. It was compared to a frontier town of the gold rush period. Citizens did what they needed to do, and their hard work played a key role in the successful outcome of the war. Victory, despite diversity, was a source of pride for all Detroiters. Before the war, the United States ranked 19th in the world in terms of manpower, and was very short of all arms and munitions. This terrifying weakness of America's military preparedness was recognized by President Franklin Roosevelt and many in Washington. As American involvement in the war came closer, they looked to Detroit. Detroit's automobile manufacturers had led the world in vehicle production, as well as pharmaceutical and chemical plants. These manufacturing giants, together with hundreds of other local companies, helped to allow the nation to quickly match and pass the industrial strength of the Axis powers, in particular Germany. German leaders did not recognize that the United States had done just that. In September 1942, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and head of Germany's industrial output, ignored warnings of America's industrial output with a comment that Americans only know how to make razor blades. That year, Germany produced 7,200 vehicles and 15,556 aircrafts. At the same time, the United States created around 24,000 vehicles and 45,000 aircrafts, and a large percentage of it came from Detroit. Labor shortages and efforts to address the shortages caused major changes to life in Detroit, which created occasional friction and conflict. The heavy inflow of hundreds and thousands of workers, mostly from rural Michigan and southern states, caused housing shortages, fomented racial tensions, and changed the demographic makeup of the city. The need for workers and high production demands led to a heightened level of union activity. Also, women on the shop floor changed the all-male orientation of these companies as well as impacted life at home. African American workers experienced discrimination and violent opposition to their hiring and promotion, which created a focused activism for wage parity and job equality. African Americans suffered to a greater degree from the shortage of housing. The great increase of workers put housing throughout southeast Michigan at a premium. 40,000 people were employed at Willow Run every day, but the local housing was only available for 14,000 people. Buildings of all kinds were converted into homes and had extended families, often sharing cramped spaces. 50,000 African American newcomers endured Detroit's most decrepit living conditions. As one housing official put it, "There's no money in housing the poorest people well." As the war progressed, the sacrifices that were demanded of Detroiters increased and patriotic empathy decreased. Poor housing conditions, racial tensions, along with a shortage of consumer goods and a strained infrastructure, finally came to a violent climax with the riot of June 1943. The growth of Union influence in the manufacturing equation was a critical employment issue related to Detroit's industrial future. The labor shortages gave the workers leverage on their employers when negotiating wages, hours, working conditions, and benefits. In spite of a patriotic promise by some organizations to avoid work stoppages, strikes were very common. In the first 10 months of 1942, there were more than 700 wildcat strikes in Detroit. Ford Motor Company, who had been able to resist union organizing efforts, was forced to negotiate with the CIO UAW to end a strike in April 1941. Labor historian Steve Babson stated, "Detroit, once the open-shop capital of the United States, was now the nation's leading union town." Southern whites also came to Detroit by tens of thousands. They had great difficulty in finding housing and commonly encountered rental signs stating, "No Southerners need to apply." They were sent to the poorest underdeveloped suburbs, often in field sheds and tents near the newly constructed mega factories. One thing that many locals and hillbillies had in common was their common prejudice against African Americans. Many Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, including the Federation, relocated Jewish refugees in the state of Michigan from Germany. This increased the population. The large workload required to build all of the military defense vehicles and weapons also led to people moving from the West to Detroit. Because of the men who went to fight the war, many women went to work in factories to build the vehicles and supplies needed for the war. What specifically important things changed in Detroit after World War II ended? It pulled local manufacturing out of the post-Depression doldrums and rapidly took it to production levels never seen before. Labor demand swelled the population, and a majority of the newcomers never left. After the war, unions fought to retain wartime prosperity at a time when availability of workers was peaking. New infrastructures expanded the metropolitan area beyond the city limits. When wartime manufacturing ended, Detroit rapidly retooled for auto production. Most 1946 models were simply new 1941 models, but people bought them as fast as Detroit could make them. The first cars off the Cadillac line had wooden bumpers. Gradually, new materials like synthetic rubber and plastics were incorporated into the manufacturing process, and styling changes brought a new era to automobile design. Wartime migration was staggering. By 1945, one of every 5 Americans had moved to another location as a result of wartime production labor needs. Studies showed that 80% remained in their adopted towns after the war. In Detroit, the city's population peaked at 1950 and almost 2 million, and regionally at over 3.25 million. Veterans returning from the European and Pacific theaters swelled the ranks of labor. Many temporary workers were laid off, and unions battled to maintain wages. While there was a period of adjustment and brief economic downturns in 1947 and 1954, Detroit's industrial base thrived. A decade after the war ended, real wages had risen by 40%. The boomtown era gave way to the baby boom era. In Will Knutson's assessment, while we had troubles in both material and labor, on the whole there was an enthusiasm and patriotism displayed which would warm anybody's heart and bolster up their faith in our country and its immense resources to finish the job. The Detroit Perspective. Who aided in the Detroit War efforts? Over the course of the war, 2/3 of the troops were drafted. In Detroit, many men received draft deferments because of the roles they played in wartime production. Skilled engineers, chemists, efficiency experts, machinists, trainers, and others were retained by their firms to support the war effort. Despite this, almost 30% of local factory workers were lost to the military. With factories often working around-the-clock shifts, manufacturers soon began to run short of qualified men to keep up the production quotas. As a result, several non-traditional groups entered the workforce, notably African Americans, women, handicapped, and elderly workers. Rosie the Riveter. Rose Will Monroe was hired to work at Ford's Willow Run Aircraft Factory in 1942, and she was chosen to appear in a promotional film encouraging women to join the country's workforce. As a result, Rosie became the nickname given to all women who entered the U.S. labor effort during World War II, and a stern-faced, muscle-flexing woman depicted in the poster became a symbol of all women who worked on domestic soil to help keep American industry moving forward. Strong women like Rosie the Riveter are certainly no strangers to Ford Motor Company, said Jan Valentik, Vice President of Ford Motor Company's Global Marketing. We owe so much to the pioneering women who first braved the factory floor at Ford Motor Company, and to Rosie the Riveter, who has come to inspire female strength for her fellow World War II female workers and to women today. Veterans Day is the perfect day to celebrate this legacy. Many manufacturing executives entered the ranks of the dollar-a-year men, production experts who worked for the government to help expedite factory output. Later in the war, many of these individuals were commissioned with the rank of general, which gave them rank within the military chain of command. While some of these executives donated their salaries to the war effort, most remained on the payroll of their former employers, while at the same time exhorting the companies to meet production quotas. Before the United States announced its involvement in the war, and the war became increasingly intense in Europe and Indochina, it captured the interest of the people in Detroit. Many people were eager to assist the countries affected by the Axis aggression, while many other people preferred to remain out of the war. The polarity of the people's opinions can be explained somewhat by Detroit's ethnic diversity and by memories of World War I. The old families of Detroit were ethnically British and French roots, and while the more recent immigrants were from nations threatened by Germany and Italy, such as Poland, Russia, Greece, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Serbia, and others. Large German and Italian neighborhoods were interested in changing the politics of their native countries, but less inclined to rush to war. Those of an Irish background had little interest in assisting Britain, while a great many Canadian immigrants could not understand any hesitation to commit. A great number of Detroiters from all ethnic backgrounds felt that this war was Europe's problem. Historian Arthur Woodford stated, "Many had come to accept the theory that American participation in World War I had been a great mistake, and that the United States should stay out of this war. Military aid given to the Allies was all that would be needed to defeat the Axis powers." An example of this viewpoint would be of Henry Ford. Ford flatly refused to assist with any war material that wasn't strictly defensive. However, Ford agreed to build airplane engines for the British government. In 1940, he stated, "If it became necessary, the Ford Motor Company could, with the counsel of men like Lindenberg and Rickenbacker, under his own under our own supervision and without meddling by the government agencies, swing into the production of 1,000 airplanes of standard design a day.
The war efforts affected the lives of the people from Detroit and those who came to Detroit. Women became not only a stay-at-home mom, but also took upon the roles of men in the family. The children were without both parents and had to often help around with things at home. The men went off to war, and this created a domino effect in everyone's life. People who worked in the factories worked even harder this time to help supply things and more. What benefited from the war efforts was Detroit's economy mainly, and also women. This experience finally gave women the chance to show the world that they can do the same things men can. Detroit's economy boomed after all the supplies they created were sent to aid in the war. The Detroit war efforts affected soldiers by causing them to leave their families and daily lives of working in the factories to aid in this war. Wake up one day and go to a factory, and then the next day they're waking up and more, if they even get to sleep much. The men who stayed working in the factories were working crazy hours to build machinery to send in the war. Detroit supplied the most supplies during World War II. The people of Detroit saw their world as the world was in trouble, and it was Detroit's job to get together as a team and help in any way possible that they can. Mothers and children did their part while the fathers were away in war. Companies and the entire economy built machinery and other supplies to send over to the troops. Everyone's daily lives were affected because every day was dedicated to helping America win this war. People saw Detroit as an opportunity and security to find business and help in this war.
Using the past. What can we learn from this time period?
From this war, we learned how women started their place in the workforce. We also learned how important of an aid Detroit was and can be. Because of this war, our economy and women grew stronger. Labor work was only limited to men because women did not have the right to work. When this war started, men had to fight, so labor crisis increased and women started to do the jobs of men. After the way, women demanded their right to work because they believed that they could do the same jobs as men after their experience during World War II. Now today, women and men have the same rights. How has this time period affected present-day Detroit? This made our economy the most trusted and talented at making machinery, mainly cars. We also had made Detroit stronger after the war had ended. Women's life were changed, increasing their labor rates. Men had to back down a little and trust women after the war. Children were exposed to this change and realized that both parents have an equal job. Our economy continued to stay strong and leading after the war. Detroit was a huge aid that other parts of the world trusted.